this special topics about human factor, we have I have the pleasure to introduce Alexandra Millonig. Millonig.
Yeah.
Okay. She's a senior scientist of RIT Institute of Technology in Austria, in Vienna. And more precisely, she worked in the Center for Mobility System. And she worked on about human factors, mobility behaviors, also, and also motivational strategies of person in mobility and multimodal approach. So,
exactly.
She proposed today to introduce the subject, the human factor of successful mobility solutions. So, Alexandra, if you can start.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for introducing me. It's my pleasure, my honor to be here, and thank you for the invitation. I'm going to present a few insights in our institute, in our work there, and what will be our next challenges. I would like to start with a general motivation, with the reason. No, this is not working. Okay, do it that way. The reason why we are doing this type of work. Okay, we all know we have different challenges, which problems we have to face when we're looking at mobility systems. For example, we have safety issues, so it's quite dangerous. We have a lot of fatalities in transport. There's congestion, so a lot of traffic jams and too much traffic on the roads. We have pollution, environmental issues we need to solve, and that's very urgent. And of course, not everybody has the same possibility, so it's also a social challenge that we have to face when we look at transport. And what we try to do, we try to find new solutions which help us to solve these problems. For example, which is something that's very important at the moment, or very popular at the moment, is the issue of self-driving cars. And we hope, of course, that self-driving cars will help us with many of those issues and solve a lot of the problems that we are currently facing. Although the problems are not new, they have been around for a while. There's been some very large conference, for example, in '89 in New York. I don't know if you heard about it. It was tackling these issues. Unfortunately, it wasn't very successful, so all the delegates from all over the world, they returned home. Do you know? Have you heard about that conference in '89? It was 1889. Yes. We had the same problems 100 years ago with increasing traffic in the cities, with horse carriages. We had congestion there. We had safety issues. We had pollution with horse feces, and the first predictions of the traffic increase were taken at that time. And of course, not everybody was able to afford their own vehicle and their own carriages. So the self-driving car was the solution at the time. But unfortunately, we know today that it didn't turn out the way that we hoped it would turn out. So we haven't really solved all the problems. 100 years later, we have the same problems. So we're seeking for other solutions. And I think something that we have learned from this century of looking at the consequences of developments in transport is that we have to take into account how humans react to the different options and the possibilities and the solutions that we offer, and not just the humans, how they change their behavior and how they adapt to new systems and solutions, but also how what are the consequences on a larger scale, for example, on a urban structure, on the spatial structure. So we have a totally different environment now, which is more or less forcing us to be on the way and to accept long travel distances, because we have shaped our environment to our transport systems rather than to the human needs. So what we try to do in our working group with integrated mobility systems is to follow a really human-centered approach and understand what are the influence factors to human mobility behavior. How can we understand how people react to different kinds of interventions? How can we also identify the interventions that are successful and accepted by different social groups, for example? And how can we achieve long-term goals which are then focusing on minimizing the environmental impact, for example, and reducing traffic amount and so on. So this is more or less the motivation. A little bit of background to our institute. So the Austrian Institute of Technology is the largest applied research institute in Austria. It's structured, it contains 8 different centers with different topics that we're working on. So for example, energy or health or digital safety and security. And there are 2 centers that are dealing with transportation questions and research topics, the Mobility Center for Mobility Systems, that's where I'm based in, and the Center for Low Emission Transport. So the Center for Low Emission Transport, they're more focusing on materials, batteries, and so on, and the mobility systems, they are more focusing, or we are more focusing on the mobility system itself, on behavior, on data, and on infrastructure. So the institute itself is, well, universities are larger, but for applied research institutes, we are the largest in Austria, as I said. We have about 1,300 employees, and the owner structure is half of the institute is owned by the Republic of Austria, the Federal Ministry for Transport, and the other one is owned by the Federation of Austrian Industries. And we get some basic funding from the ministry, and the rest is contract research and grants. So now a little bit more details to the Center for Mobility Systems. So what we are focusing here on is we have 2 different units, different business units, and the topics are covering passenger transport, then freight transport, and the transportation infrastructure. We have 6 different research fields that we're covering here. So the first 3 are covered by dynamic transportation systems. That's a business unit where I'm based in. And the other 3 are covered by the other business units, which is called transportation infrastructure technologies. So they are focusing on infrastructure and transport safety. And our topics are mobility data collection and analysis, then integrated mobility systems, and transport optimization and logistics. So those are the research fields. And so my focus, so for my background, I've studied regional planning with a focus on sociology and transport research. And this is also, I'm not an engineer, although I have a degree from a University of Technology, but I'm not a pure engineer, but I'm more of a hybrid between engineer and social scientist, which is, I think, beneficial for the group and very interesting to bring in other insights. But I'm also not a sociologist, I'm not a psychologist, but I try to take in as much as possible from different perspectives and to combine it and using them for our applied research. So when we look at the behavior of people, of course, we have to look at the context somebody is acting within. So they have different purposes they want to follow, they have different options they can use, they have time constraints, for example, different information that they can access. So this is, on the one hand, so this is the external conditions that are defining the way people are traveling around and how they use the transport system. But at the same time, in the same context situation, people are behaving differently. And the reason is that they have some internal influence factors as well, like kind of a habitus, so habits, experiences, skills, interests, preferences. And those are the things that make it a little bit more complicated because it's not easy so easy to grasp those influence factors. So if we think about, for example, little thought experiment, this nice young man here has a new job and wants to get to his workplace, his work location, and he has to decide how to get there. Of course, there are some external influence factors, for example, the mobility options he has at place and he can use. Then the experiences he has, or does he have a ticket or driver's license or whatever. And then what are the regulations, the norms, and so on. So based on that, this is something that we can observe and measure and so on. There are specific options that can be taken. And then, of course, he has his internal perspective, his internal filter, shaped by his preferences, by his experiences, which narrows it down. So it narrows all the possibilities down and weighs it in a specific way. Then there are situational influences, of course, because if the weather is nasty, the decision might be different than if the weather is fine, or if it's summer, winter, or it has something to carry, or is together with kids, or whatever. So situational factors come into place as well. And taking this all into consideration, this young man here uses his prefrontal cortex to rationalize what would be the best way to get there, and he takes a decision, decides to go there by car. And if he's lucky, and there's no congestion and no negative experiences, he will go there, will be there at his job on time. He will be very happy. So on the next day in the same situation, he will probably do the same. And after a specific number of repetitions, so the literature says about 60 repetitions or 2 months doing the same things, this is something that's going to be automated. So it's nothing that people think about anymore, so they will develop a habit. And even if something changes here at the beginning, and if it's not that severe, the change is not severe, people will maintain their habit. Even if there's more congestion, if there's anything that gets less convenient, people will stick to their habit because the other things are still, they are unknown, people are insecure to change their behavior. So this makes it very difficult for us to understand behavior because if we observe them, and even if we ask people, why do you do that? This is something that's automated, so they will not necessarily come up with the real reasons because they don't know them. And the habit has formed somewhere in the past, and we cannot really explain what happened and why people are behaving in a specific way. Okay, so dealing with this complex system and all the difficulties that we are facing here, we try to approach it using different disciplines, for example, different reference systems and theories which help us understanding why people are behaving in a specific way and how we can use it then in our approaches, in our simulations and models, for example. So what we use currently for no, that's not what we currently use, but what's common at the moment for modeling systems is rational choice modeling, for example. So you take all the influence factor, you look into what is the income, what's the family size, what's the quality of transport, and you rationalize it and take a decision and model then the demand and how people behave. But it's not that accurate because we've just seen that decisions are not always based at the time and on rational on-time decisions, but there are more advanced models as well. For example, the theory of planned behavior takes into account, for example, attitudes and norms and the perceived control people have in specific situations. But still, it's very rational. So it always assumes that people think about what to do and they weigh different possibilities, for example. So it's still, yeah, it's good, but there's a lot of criticism on the theory as well. So what we use at the moment is a combination of different approaches we take from different disciplines and try to include that in our models. For example, a lot of influence on behavior is based on the region, on the spatial structure somebody is acting within. For example, it's of course there's a huge difference if you live somewhere on the mountaintop or in the city center. It explains a lot of the actions that the transport behavior that you actually show. So, and it's not just the spatial structure, it's of course also the norms that are perceived in this area, for example. So if you are in the Netherlands, cycling is the normal, this is the norm. So somebody who moves to the Netherlands will quickly adapt to this new behavior and is more likely to start cycling than somebody who is moving to Vienna, for example, where it's not that popular. At the same time, if you live in the US, it's normal to go there by car. Or if you live on the countryside in Austria, it's also normal to go there by car if you only have to go for 200 meters, so you will still take the car. So this is normal, nobody questions that, and it's not even taken into consideration if it's normal or not. So this is on the regional, the spatial level. Then there is the social practice theory, which might explain how we develop specific habits and specific patterns of behavior. This is from sociology concept, which says, okay, to explain a specific behavior, to form a specific behavior, you first of all need the material. So you need, for example, vehicles, access to a bike, cycling infrastructure, for example, and information systems that are available. And you need the competences to use it. So you have to know how to use a ticket machine, for example. You have to have learned how to ride a bike, for example. So those two factors explain if you can use a specific option. And then there's another important factor, that's meaning, which just says you have to want to do that as well. So if you're not interested in taking an alternative, for example, because it's not in your frame of reference, you're not used to it, you're afraid of it, for example, it's not important for you, or not enough fun, then you won't do it, even if it's actually possible for you to do it. So we also have to take into account those different influence areas, not just the options, developing the options, but also can people use it. It's also based on their background, their experiences, and also their willingness to change their behavior. And then there's on the psychological level, and I suppose you know more about that than I do. We were taking into account dual process theory, which more or less says this is the way we like to view ourselves. We are rational, we are reasonable, we take everything into account and weigh it and take a meaningful, reasonable decision. But this is just not even 10% of the cases. Usually, unfortunately, we were not Spock, we are Homer. So we follow our gut feelings and what we always do, and just the way it feels, and not necessarily if it's really reasonable or not. So this is also the reason why, if we observe behavior, it doesn't really always seem to be really rational. So we also take into account, for example, behavior biases from behavior economics, for example, which also explain a lot of the things, the phenomena that we can observe when we look into the behavior. This is also connected, of course, all these levels are connected to projects we already do. For example, on the spatial level, what we did here is we developed a model for assessing the transport quality of locations. So we looked at locations and the accessibility, so the distance of different opportunities, for example, shopping or education or whatever, and calculated an index of the quality of transportation systems there on different levels for different modes of transport. And we also did it for different social groups, for example. So, for example, a young family with young kids, they have different needs and they need to go to different places than elder people, for example. So we can use this system to analyze the quality of accessibility of a specific location, use it then either for providing information for people who want to move somewhere else, for example, so they can take into account how to reach different places from their new home location, for example, but also for municipalities, they can analyze the area then and see if it's really optimal for specific social groups. Then when we look on the social practice theory level, of course, we can do projects and we can develop ideas on different levels, for example. We had materials, competences, and meaning, for example. I've brought an example for each of them. So regarding the material, when we think about self-driving vehicles, automated vehicles, we automatically think of cars. But there are a lot of other options that we can use, for example, supporting active transport. And what we did here is a project supporting people in public transport when they're walking in intersections and they have to carry loads. For elder people as well, for example, they can book such a system which helps them not just to carry the goods, it follows them and it's a little bit fancy, but it's not meant to write on it. So it's just for the suitcases. And we're currently also working on a follow-up project where it's not just for intersections, for railway systems, but for other context situations as well. For example, hospitals, where it can help to support the caregivers. And of course, it's not only meant to follow you, but it can also help you find your way. So if you don't know where to find the taxi, for example, you can ask the system, and then you just follow it, and it will lead you wherever you want. So this is a new and a different concept of automated transport, which is supporting an active form of transport or public transport. Then on the competences side, we did, for example, one of our PhD students has been working on the issue that people have learned how to ride a bike, for example, as children, but later on, for every day, they have taken up other habits. They are not using the bicycles anymore because they don't feel secure. They don't feel self-confident enough to do it on a daily basis in daily traffic. So what he has been working on is a system, a virtual biking coach, which helps you using sensors on the bike to give you feedback on your skills and to improve your skills when cycling in different situations in traffic. So the idea is you don't have to, if you are shy, to ask somebody to help you. A human coach, for example, you can use this system to improve your cycling skills, to get more self-confident and start get over this initial barrier to start cycling in the city. And it's we did it in cooperation with the MIT in Boston because they are currently working on the so-called persuasive electric vehicle, which is a bike and equipped with a lot of sensors. So this gave us the idea to use such a bike for such purposes as well. And on the meaning scale, for example, we were also in the same cooperation, we were working also on the biking issue. We have, for example, I don't know if there's something similar in France, but in Austria we have a Bike to Work campaign, Bike to Work program each year in May. Everybody is invited to join a competition. And companies can form teams and they collect cycling mileage and they can win prizes then. We were interested in as researchers, we were interested in the effectiveness of such programs and what are the actual motivations and triggers for people to participate. So we did the same thing in Boston, and we had 3 different categories where people could compete, and it was on the company level. Different companies were participating in this biking tourney, and what we found out was very interesting. People are not participating because they're interested in the prizes. It was much more a social component. So they were interested in doing something together. Those who were already cycling, they were interested in encouraging others to start cycling as well. And those who were a little bit afraid of cycling, they were very eager to get help from their colleagues. And it was a very good social aspect in the companies. And one of the categories we had was enthusiasm, which was not based on the mileage you cycled or the amount of people participating, but more on the level of how many more people can you encourage to join. And this was a huge motivator for specific companies because they were, during the last days of the test weeks, they were more or less really encouraging their colleagues to join. It was more successful and more effective for them than actual mileage or amount of people participating, which was very interesting for us to see. And we know from the Austrian example, where we did analysis of the data, that a quarter of all people participating in such a tourney are actually going to maintain their increased cycling behavior afterwards. So it's very successful. But of course, limitation is it's mostly encouraging people who are already biking. So we need to combine it maybe with the virtual cycling coach to get more people on the bike, or combine it with other methods as well. So, and on the decision part and the gut feelings and so on, people are not necessarily interested in mobility and in the environment. So if you want to encourage them to change their behavior, we shouldn't, or it's not that successful to tell them it's for the environment or it's for mobility reasons, because that's not something that people are constantly thinking about and are constantly interested in. So here I don't have a video, but I can explain you what we did in this project. So the idea was not to use gamification, but using games to have a different access point, not telling them this is about mobility, but we developed a few game concepts, and this one was based on the idea that people get presented different alternatives to their normal routes they take, and they can bet on different qualities. For example, which of the routes is, where can you get the best suntan, or where will you meet the most people, or the fewest people, or whatever. And you can set bets on it, on the different routes, and then either lose or win. And it's kind of a strip poker on a very child-friendly way. So you use your clothing, your items, until you're there in your underwear, and there's the wall of shame at the end, and you can compare with others. And this is therefore encouraging you to learn more about the alternatives and get better in assessing the alternatives and know what are the qualities of different routes, for example, or of different modes of transport. So this is a different approach, not focusing on the mobility aspect of an app, for example, but using another trigger and using more or less a backdoor to communicate mobility content. So basically what we are focusing in the integrated mobility systems is, first of all, we want to understand how human behavior is influenced, what are the determinants, what are the differences in the behavior patterns. And we do this by also developing new methods and combining different qualitative and quantitative methods. Because as I explained previously, if we just observe behavior, if you ask people, we would not necessarily get the full insight. So we have to combine different methods and try to get the most realistic insight into behavior influences. And of course, we use this knowledge then to develop, to improve our models and our simulations on different levels, on the micro to the macro level, and use those models then to assess the effectiveness of different interventions, for example, to help decision support and assess the impact of different alternatives, of different interventions that are planned, for example. But also to have a tool, an instrument to more or less educate decision takers on the long-term effects of the decisions they take and on possible long-term consequences that they may not be taken into account because they are not really familiar with the human reactions to different interventions. So the dimensions are, first of all, identify different profiles, for example, of people, attitude profiles, for example, behavior profiles, to use this as populations then for the models as well, and to know also which people are affected in a very specific, in a very severe way, and limited in a very severe way, or the amount of people is affected from of a specific barrier, or who can benefit from a specific intervention, for example. And also understand the specific determinants that we can use and that we can manipulate in order to help behavior change. Then on the next level, developing the appropriate methods and also understand, detect and handle the bias that comes with every method. So of course there is no method which has no bias, but we at least, as we understand which bias we have to deal with, we can combine it with other methods to to make the best out of it. And then, of course, we want not just to provide the transport system for the future, but we want to encourage behavior change. We have a few long-term goals and very sophisticated goals that we want to achieve. And we need behavior change. We need all people to participate in that way, and we need to encourage people to really change their behavior to more active mobility behavior, for example, and using less energy and less, producing less pollution and so on. So this is not necessarily something that's important for all the people, but we need to find out how we can make it important by using other triggers, for example, for all the people. So and now I would just go roughly through a series of different projects that we do in this different perspectives. Some of the projects, of course, are related to different, to more than one of these aspects. And if you have questions, just interrupt me, and you can anytime pose questions, because I don't have that much time to go into detail with all of the projects. But I wanted to show them anyway. This, for example, was a project, an EU project, focusing on the mobility of older people. And older people are a very heterogeneous group. So if you think about your parents, grandparents, and relatives and other people you know, everybody knows that they are very different. They're not all the same. All they have in common is their age, but in terms of attitudes and behavior, they are very different. So this is, of course, a problem if we want to make our transport systems fit for the future elderly people. And what we did here is we used a very large database on the European level from 20 different countries. I think 50,000 people in there, with mainly health-related items that have been collected there. And we used that, combined with other methods as well, to develop profiles of older people, which describe not just their mobility behavior, but also specific determinants of mobility behavior. For example, their health status, of course, but also how they are socially connected to family or friends, so if they are active or not, what are their interests, what are main transition points in their life, for example. So, for example, for many older people, when they retire, it's a very severe interruption of the normal routine, and in many cases they have many social contacts in their working place, they lose those contacts, and they get less active and get less out meeting other people, for example, which has, of course, also implication on their health and on their activity and on their mobility options. So we identified 5 different profiles. We used names for the profiles which should speak for themselves, more or less. So fit as a fiddle are the young, and there's not much different to people who are still working, for example, or younger people. And on the other spectrum is the careful, who are very frail and need a lot of support and help. And there are different profiles in between. And of course, there are sort of careers between the different profiles. And we try to identify what are the contact points between the profiles. So what makes you enter a specific profile or fall out of a specific profile, and how can transportation systems and services contribute to get you or help you being as active as possible, as long as possible. So another project where we were identifying different profiles or types of behavior, this was actually my PhD project, where I looked into the spatial temporal behavior in a specific context situation, and I used shopping as a context situation because I used a lot of observations and a combination of different methods like observation, interviews, and tracking to understand how people move around in a specific context for a specific purpose, and what are their influence factors, and identified also 6 different profiles, which we are not only looking. I know they are all women. I'm sorry. I need to get a better picture for that. Sorry for that. But Yeah, there was a gender difference as well, of course, yeah. But not so much as women love to go shopping that much, but a large share of the women who went shopping, they were just responsible for shopping because their partners wouldn't go shopping, so they had to do it. Yeah, but that was not the main focus of the research. I was more interested in how they are moving around, so what are the places they're using, how long are they staying there, are they under stress or not, and I combined it with social influence factors, social media groups, so also with the interests and preferences and aversions people had. Then another project where we were looking at different groups of transportation disadvantaged, so like the blind or the people in wheelchairs, but also people with large families with more than 3 children or single parents and so on. We looked at their needs, transportation needs, and the barriers that they experience, and also what can be combinations of different limitations that people are experiencing, and what are the implications then for the transport system. And we also did it on a representative sample for Austria, so we had a kind of an idea how many people are actually affected in Austria, or which measures need to be taken. So then on the involve part, where we try to develop new methods to understand how people are behaving. Here we work, for example, with virtual environments, because if you observe people in the natural environment, the natural environment is of course changing a lot. For example, if you look at a railway station, the amount of people being there is always changing. There are different announcements and different levels of stress. And so we used or developed a virtual environment where people can move freely, and there are agents in there, simulated agents also walking around in there. So we have a stable environment for the experiments, and we can test different interventions, different signage systems, for example, so what gets visible for the test persons in there, and we can manipulate the environment in a very specific way and understand how it works for different people then. Or we use, so that's not necessarily my research group, but we work closely together with the other research groups in dynamic transportation systems, of course. They've developed a smartphone-based solution for automated mode detection. So just by carrying your smartphone, the system will detect if you are using a car or a bus or a tramway or a train by using different sensors and combining it with GPS information, so placing you on the network, and which is very helpful for surveys, because we know when we ask people to describe their behavior, and if we use diaries or surveys, it's not that accurate, and a lot of the trips or parts of the trips are not really they don't get remembered by people. This is the reason, for example, why when people walk somewhere, so the footpath, they're always underrepresented in surveys. So we really have a better insights, and we can combine it with online surveys and make people also reflect about their own behavior, because they get a very accurate picture of what they're actually doing, and which helps them also to rationalize what might be the influence factors, why they're behaving in a specific way. Or this one, where we were looking at waiting behavior in stations, bus stations, railway stations, and so on, for example. We were interested here in how can we enhance the waiting experience, not just by advertisements, which is very common at the moment, but what is the most effective way, because waiting is the least convenient part of the journey. So if you have to wait a lot, many people will try to find an alternative, maybe go by car, because it's even less convenient to wait for a train than to be in a traffic jam, it seems. So we wanted to understand how we can encourage this behavior, what are actually people doing when they're waiting for a service, and how is the perception of waiting time influenced by different types of actions that people are taking. And we were providing here different opportunities to interact with the system, just watching it or communicate with others via the system. And it was very interesting to see that not just the type of system that we were providing here was influencing the perception of the waiting time, the subjective duration of waiting time, but also the setting of the station. So the information system providing the time that the next service is actually going to arrive. Also the furniture and other influence factors are very important, which was helpful for transportation providers who were of course very interested in that result. So, and then for the last part, we did some projects concerning gamification and game mechanics, understanding what is the experience of different systems, services, how can we enhance the experience, how can we use it, because there are several approaches, many approaches actually, projects that try to enhance navigational services, for example, with gamification, trying to persuade people to use a specific mode of transport, for example. And in many cases, the rationale behind it is you're doing something for the environment. But the environment is not very interesting for everybody, but not many people are willing to change their behavior just for the sake of the environment. And to accept that they will have less convenient travel. So this is not something that's really encouraging and triggering people to change their behavior. So we were trying to find out what could be other aspects, triggers, motivators, game elements that are interesting for people, not just to reward a specific type of behavior, but to reward getting information about alternatives and learn about alternatives and take a reasonable, a more rational decision than before. And we developed here a game as a research tool to understand what is the effect of a specific game mechanic used in a system, for example. So we compared competition to exploration, for example, because there are different player types as well who are interested in different game mechanics. And we used it afterwards, implemented it in a navigation system to get people more interested in comparing different alternatives and trying out a new alternative. That's the same idea, more or less, but not a gamified navigation system, but again, a game with transportation information that's provided. Here we were mainly focusing on young people. I have sons myself. They are really interested in collecting cards, in trading cards. And this is a mobility-based game which also encourages you to take real-world challenges, to find new cards in the real world. I don't know how many of you have played Pokemon Go, which has also been very popular among several people and made them go outside and walk more. So the idea is to get people more interested and maybe find out that walking outside is nice, even if you're not chasing Pokemons or chasing whatever, new barcodes for new cards. So that's the concept we're following here as well. And the last project I wanted to mention in this respect is, of course, what we try to do is encourage new behavior, but it's not that easy to know how to address somebody and what's really interesting for people. So what we did here in this project is we used a market research approach, looking into different social groups, social milieu groups. That's a concept that's been developed already 30 years ago, I think, in the German-speaking countries, which is, in the meantime, it's provided for different countries, nations as well, all over the world. And those social milieus describe in a very comprehensive way what are the values of people and what is their social status and so on. And we use this concept in the mobility context to understand what type of information people are actually gaining or seeking, and how images of different transport modes are developing in people. So how people are starting to prefer a specific mode of transport over the other. So maybe it's based in childhood experiences or images that are provided by advertisements or whatever. So we tried to find out where the preferences come from and which type of information is actually used by different groups of people and which channels they are using. So what type of media, for example, digital media, non-digital media, and how we can, which arguments to use to encourage them to change their behavior. So be it cost arguments or experience, fun, environment as well, and so on. So we based it on this model. It's called potato model because it has this. I don't know if you have if anybody has seen it already. Basically, it shows. This is for Austria. It's 10 different milieu groups, referring to their social status and their values in life. So if they're more traditional or more modern or a totally new direction, and they have, for example, those are the younger milieu groups, the digital individualists, very young people, very heavily using social media, for example, and digital media, very spontaneous. And then we have hedonists here on the lower side. They're really fun-oriented. And all of those different groups, they can be described from the market perspective in a very comprehensive way. And it helps us understanding what is really interesting for them and how to approach them. And then we related for Austria representative study 6 different types of persuasion types, which can be addressed in a specific way and encouraged in a specific way using specific arguments. For example, the spontaneous on-the-go type. They are interested in efficiency, flexibility. Those are the ones who use sharing systems, for example. They organize their traveling with on-trip information and so on. They are also willing to share systems. They don't need to own their own vehicle, for example. And this is a growing group, but we have to wait as soon as those people get older and they have their own families and get children, their behavior may change as well. So it's also very interesting to see how those people develop and how their interests change over the time. And then we have other, this is the group which can be partly encouraged by using environmental arguments because they have some environmental responsibility and can be motivated in that way. And then we have different other groups. This one, for example, those are car lovers. They won't give up their own car because they think it's the most efficient way. And so we have different profiles identified, and we also have strategies how to address them and which communication channel to use. So those were just insights in existing research and just a very brief overview of what we are planning to do in the future. Of course, we need to look more into user segmentation, understand more what are specific profiles in specific contexts or aspects that are relevant for us. For example, how is travel time perceived in different context situations, if you can use the time, which is relevant for example, for transport providers, if they provide Wi-Fi in trains, for example, how is this changing the use of travel time? Or if the systems get faster, is this really beneficial? So what's the cost-benefit ratio? Then the digital divide, of course, because we very much focus on digitalization and on apps, but what is the group which is actually willing and able to use these new forms of information, who are the ones who will actually lose to get access to information, will have disadvantages if we just focus on a specific information channel. And then, of course, transition points here, understand what makes people change their behavior. At the moment, we have a master thesis looking into mobility biographies and trying to understand what are specific points in time in life-changing situations that provoke changes in the mobility behavior, to understand that better and to include it in our models as well. Then when we deal with new systems and we use stated preferences, we know that people are not necessarily able to imagine the new situation, it's very difficult for them to assess if they are actually going to change, if they're actually willing to use a new system, for example, or not. So the results from stated preferences are not necessarily that accurate. So what we try to develop here is a SP of RP survey, a tool which provides personalized questions which are based in the reality of the participants. So it's not just stating, would you be interested in using a sharing system, but it's using information we gather from people about their actual behavior and providing alternatives, for example. For example, this is your usual work trip, and those are new alternatives with very accurate information, personalized for the respondents, and which helps them in assessing in a better way what would be the change in behavior, if any, which would give us more accurate insight into the actual changes that can be achieved when introducing new interventions, new systems, new offers, for example. So this is something that we're working at the moment as well. And as I said, it's very important to communicate the consequences, rebound effects, for example, of interventions for stakeholders, for municipalities. So what we want to do is here not just to encourage people to use full-fledged modeling of new interventions, but develop a quick assessment tool which gives you very quickly a rough estimation of what is the effect of an intervention that you're planning and what could be long-term rebound effects or backfire effects that you actually want to avoid and how to avoid them. And this should be something that's very easily accessible for stakeholders, not so much on the very high research sophisticated level, to make it easier to get in contact and take into account what we can actually achieve with new methods and new measures and new interventions. And this is not very good visible, but that's one of the models that we were using for an area in the western part of Austria, where we used the model, a Matsim model, for assessing the impact of different interventions, for example, introducing new cycling infrastructure, or also spatial interventions with a new mixture of land use, for example. And we also have to take into account mobility is not just mobility, getting from A to B, but it's very much interrelated with spatial developments and urban developments. And by my education, I did regional and urban planning. And this is something that we have really to take into account and to prioritize our work and our ideas. It's not just to optimize mobility, but we have to look at the spatial structure. The best mobility is the mobility that we can avoid, the transport that we can avoid. So the first priority should be proximity. And I've learned that in Paris, 50% of all trips are walking trips, which is excellent. And this is something that should be maintained, of course. So we should try to achieve this in most urban areas and most areas to provide proximity and to encourage people to use short distances and find as much as possible in their vicinity. And if that's not possible, we can use connectivity concepts, maybe compensated with teleworking, for example, with cycling delivery, for example, in order to minimize mobility aspects. And if there's no other way to deal with the spatial problem that we have to do something in another place, then we should focus on mobility options that are as sustainable as possible. And this is something that we try to achieve. So what does this mean then in connection with our previous question on self-driving vehicles, self-driving cars? This is the ideal that we are following at the moment. It's not a new idea, of course. It's been there since the 60s. But of course, if we take into account not just the positive side, but also the things that can go wrong, could also be this way. I don't know if you've seen WALL-E, which is the other scope of automated vehicles, so with obesity and social exclusion, urban sprawl, and of course if we have less fatalities on the roads, we have less donor organs, which is also something that we have to take into account. So if we are aware of that, what could be the rebound effects and the backfire effects, we can provide the right solution and think about what problems are we actually solving with a specific solution, and what is the gap that we are trying to close with a specific solution. And I think it's in our hands. And so, well, let's do it together. Thank you.
We have time for some questions.
Yes. Thank you for your interesting presentation. I have a lot of questions. I think I don't have time for all my questions, but you speak about, you use some games and you study some rewards and so on. And you say like information is one of the rewards that people appreciate. It's which other reward did you find in your work?
Other than information, or?
I think it was on slide 29, an example of gaming.
Okay. I do it this way, it's faster. So informed decisions, do you mean that? Informed decisions, yeah. That's what we were trying to achieve, not just provide information, because we know also from the literature that just providing information does not mean that people will actually consume this information and use this information. But what we're trying to achieve is encourage them to take informed decisions by educating them in an entertaining way, so that they have more information without actually just seeking the information, but by making it fun to get information and taking then informed decisions. Yeah.
And did that use of informed decision change with you?
Yes, yes. We don't have, well, it was one study that we did with a limited, of course, a limited sample, as always in research studies. I know, I'm sure you all know that, but there were different game elements they weren't all effective in the same way. What I found interesting is that quizzes were very effective. So they were fun. People were really interested if they gave the right answer or not. So it really helped them. And it was just general about mobility, not really on a specific route or alternative, for example, not as the strip poker game that I introduced as well. But it was roughly related to the decisions they were taking on a daily basis. They were presented different route alternatives, but they were invited in after taking a decision to do a quiz about it and get questions. And this was one of the most effective elements that we tested in there, although we weren't sure if people want to have rewards. So what is the best reward that people want to have? Do they want to have monetary rewards, or do they want to have points or badges or whatever? But it was actually the explorative aspect of the quiz itself, which was effective enough. So it wasn't that much the points. But of course, it was depending on the player type. So we had, of course, people who were very much eager on being top on the high score. But in general, the quizzes were, even if you don't provide any monetary rewards, they were very effective.
You present many projects. On which are you working the most?
The most? I've been working on all of them. Yes, I'm at the moment, we have been developing projects more on the consulting side of urban development projects, for example, where we try to get a whole mobility concept. For example, there's one project, an international project, where we look into different cities and develop there depending on the social structure of people there and the mobility options that are in a specific residential area, what could be new services or how could they be communicated in a specific way that is most effective for the spatial structure at the moment. Otherwise, I just finished the project with the games, with the trading card games, and the promotion project with the persuasive profiles. And I wrote at the moment several proposals and hope that some of them get funded. So I'm just in between. But I've been working on all of them and more of them. In our institute, it's a custom that we don't work on a specific project, but we work on different projects in different combinations of teams, which gives us a lot of insights and a lot of stress, of course. But it's very beneficial, I think, for us because we learn a lot from different disciplines and different perspectives.
And I have also another question about autonomy. About goods transportation and versus passenger transportation.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that for sociological and psychological works, is there very different problem? Is it very similar or very specific for goods transportation? Is there more different target groups, behavior or not, less or more? Is your work on one subject can be applied some part of them for the second subject?
Of course, much of the things we learn can be applied in a specific way to other problems as well. But if it's about the difference between passenger transport and freight transport, I think there is a difference because in passenger transport people are part of the experience, of course, and it makes a lot more difference for them if they're a part of the experience and if it's an automated service or not, and if they accept it and what is and how convenient it is for them, for example, than for freight transport because they receive the freight and they don't have the transportation experience. So this is not the main factor. That's influencing their decision how to use it.
Because there is a continuous subject for example, you see some person in station with his luggage. So the person is with its luggage. It's not very separate. So there is no distinction between the two subjects, I think. Sometimes also, perhaps not for transport, but for mobility, perhaps we can think about the mobility of other persons, even we are in the same place. I think that there is no one subject with the passenger and the person inside the group and another subject where it's outside the group. I think that there is a continuum of situation.
Of course, yeah. As I said, there are many influence factors to decisions that are taken or mobility patterns that show. And of course, the situational aspects are a very important factor there. And of course, you also have to take into account that people are in the same situation will behave in a different way. So we have to understand where this behavior comes from. And of course, I was making the same mistake that I think other people are doing as well. I was thinking about automated transport in cars. I wasn't thinking at my own example now at the beginning. But of course, yeah. This is something we also have to learn, I think. The concept of automated transport is that new, that we don't have that much insight. We have assumptions, of course, how people are going to react to it, but we have to learn more in specific situations. So as soon as we have test areas and can observe how people are really behaving, I don't think it's an acceptance problem because if it's convenient and people try it out and it works at the first time, they will quickly adapt to it. But still, I think that the consequences and long-term consequences and how people are going to react to it and how they really will adapt their behavior, and also how different social groups, for example, are going to use the systems. that's something that we mainly have assumptions at the moment. Yeah, but I think it's very important to think about different scenarios and to observe the real development and see in which type of scenarios we're actually going to develop and to see what are the consequences there. And I think that's something that needs to be done now, and we shouldn't wait to do that. I don't know if I answered your questions, but...
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.